virtual Planning Commission meeting. I'll call this into session for July 29th. Thank you for all that are here. I know Mr. Gates was going to try to get back in time for this, but was unfortunately not going to be able to. And Mr. McCormick is going to try as well. So as far as we know, as Lynette mentioned, I think many of us have been in these meetings, and one of the biggest things is obviously hit the mute button. Don't forget to unmute it if you'd like to be recognized. And obviously say your name for the record. And we'll try to make this most efficient and expeditiously as possible. Going forward, Lynette, I guess we'll just do if you could do the roll call just for the record.
I lost the audio. This is Gary.
Yeah. Lynette, are you there?
I don't hear anything.
No. Sorry, I'm here.
Okay. Can you do the roll call, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I apologize. We have Mr. Ketting.
I'm here.
Mr. Bennett.
Here.
Mr. McCormick.
Here.
Mr. Davis.
Here.
Mr. Campbell. I'm not seeing that Mr. Campbell is here.
No.
He is absent. Mr. Gates is absent. Ms. Smith?
Here.
Ms. Ireland?
Here.
And Mr. Wren?
Here. Thank you.
So currently, we have Mr. Gates and Mr. Campbell absent.
Could I please get approval of the agenda today?
I will make a motion to approve the agenda as written.
This is Brett. I'll second.
Okay.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? And it's passed. Next is general public comment, and this is new. Lynette, I understand that you are the arbitrator of the public comment section.
I do. If anyone would like to speak, they can call in to the number that's included on our agenda. They will need to unmute by hitting *6 once they are brought into the meeting. I currently don't see anyone waiting, but we can wait just a couple of minutes.
Okay. And I'll go ahead and try to explain what we'll try to do with this meeting and so forth to try and open to any ideas. As many of you, or some of you may remember, we had this information meeting back probably 6 months ago or so about revisions to our zoning code pertaining to non-conforming lots, structures, and uses. We've had several new commission members since then, and obviously I've forgotten a lot of the stuff since then, so I thought it'd be good for almost to start over and go through the process. Michelle's got a PowerPoint presentation, and what we were thinking is if she could just go through that. If anybody has any questions, just jot them down, write them down. And then after her presentations, we can just all go around and literally almost roll call. That way anybody has the floor for the duration and can have any questions answered or any ideas brought up at that time. And then once everybody has an opportunity to speak the first time, then we can circle back around and have conversations and dive deeper into this and go from there. Does that sound good with everybody? Or does anybody have ideas?
Well, that sounds fine.
Sounds good to me.
And Mr. Wren, I do not see anyone waiting in the lobby, so if you would like, we can go ahead and continue.
Okay, thanks, Lynette. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle at this time. Michelle, if you don't mind, kind of tell us what brought us to this point, why we're looking at this, and kind of the history of it, and just take it from here. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first, can everybody hear me, and can everybody see my screen?
This is Gary. Yes, for me.
Okay.
Yes, for Kathy Smith.
Okay,
Yeah, this
Yes.
is Bruce. I'm looking at it from the YouTube feed.
Okay, great. Okay. So as Mr. Wren said, a lot of this, we first brought this topic to you, I believe, in February, and it was kind of an introductory going into what our current regulations are, just to kind of set the foundation so that we could begin to discuss some potential revisions to our ordinance. This is not something new. This has been an issue with municipalities going back to the 1920s. So this has always been something that municipalities have dealt with, and we've dealt with it for many years. But what really kind of brought it to the forefront was the development known as Sullivan's Point. This just kind of forced town council and staff and the commission to kind of think about when ordinances change and you have uses that are left non-conforming either with regards to their use or their development standards, then it creates a problem and a hardship for the owner. But there's the legality of it and the fact that court cases have allowed this to occur. And so we're just going to kind of start with what we currently have right now. So why are we looking at this? The use or activity is a way of a property is currently developed that is no longer compatible with future plans, or it's deemed unacceptable to the community.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
Can you run your presentation forward? Is it moving?
Here we go. Yes.
Okay.
So, got it. Okay.
Thanks.
I forgot we got these pop-ups. So oftentimes it's known as detrimental to the orderly development of the town, and that's sort of the language that we use in our ordinances. So things that can end up being non-conforming it's typically when you have a change in your regulations and your regulations are more restrictive than they were before. So it deals with uses, buffers, parking, setbacks. We reduce height, we reduce density, we apply special overlays, lot sizes change, so all sorts of things. We have two different types, and a lot of times when folks use non-conforming, they just think of it as legal. Well, there's legal and there's illegal. And if the use existed prior to the ordinance, but the previous ordinance didn't allow that use or allow that particular type of standard, then it's illegal, regardless of how long it's been operating or it's been there. That is an existing illegal use. An existing legal use is something that met the ordinances, and then the ordinances changed. And so that's where you talk about having a legally established non-conforming use. And again, the term we typically use is grandfathered in. Zoning changes cannot be retroactive. They apply to future development. So typically we allow these uses that are legally established, non-conforming, to continue to remain with certain limitations. They can be passed along to successive owners. And typically these regulations were changed for a reason. We amend our comprehensive plans, we amend our zoning ordinances, the character of areas change, and so there's different reasons why this occurs. So type of non-conforming situations, we have the non-conforming use, a site, a lot, and a structure. And again, this is how our current ordinance is split up. Different ways that we handle this issue. It is the property owner's responsibility to prove the validity of a nonconformity. So a lot of times we'll have folks come in and say, this is what I have, but it's been like this all along, and they have to prove to us that when it was put into effect that it met those ordinances that were in effect at the time. So we handle this different ways. We'll allow them to continue with the opportunity to maintain the property or make some improvements so long as they don't intensify the activity. We require conformity if it's abandoned, typically for a period of 6 months. We require conformity if its proposed improvements exceed a certain amount. Right now, that's a 50% of the reasonable replacement value. And then you can also aggressively amortize the activity out of existence. And there is some legal case law for doing this, and it is done in certain states. These are just some of our regulations. I'm not going to read all these. Some case law that supports these ordinances, and y'all got this ahead of time, so I'm not going to read through all this. So how we handle the issue, we have lots, structures, or uses. You can have ongoing maintenance, abandonment, or cessation and require conformity if proposed improvements exceed that 50% as I mentioned before. So again, we'll touch on the lots. Right now, our ordinance says if you have 2 or more adjoining non-conforming lots, but they're under the same ownership, we require them to combine the lots to make them conforming. And you're supposed to do this even if you intend to sell one of the lots off. So we want to make sure that if there are situations where lots under the same ownership can be aggregated to be conforming, that we want to handle it in that way. For non-conforming structures and uses, you can do repairs, alterations, and maintenance. Ordinary non-structural repairs or maintenance may be made as required to keep it safe. And then we talk about any non-conforming building or structure if it's renovated or repaired beyond that 50%. And that 50% is something we'll talk about a little bit later, that there is some ambiguity there. And I think that's something that we would like to look at changing along with some other things. So a change of use, if you've got a non-conforming building, structure, land use that's non-conforming, you can't change it to another non-conforming use. So it can continue, if you have a non-conforming use, it can continue to operate, but when there's a change in use, it has to conform to the current ordinances. Restoration of damaged structure, we talked about this quite a bit in our February meeting, where we talked about the damage, 50% of the reasonable replacement value, and we talked about the type of damage, whether it's due to neglect or due to a natural disaster, those sorts of things. And so one of the things we talked about was wanting to differentiate between those types of damage that occur. Extensions. A non-conforming building or structure can be extended. There can be extensions so long as it doesn't increase the non-conformity, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more. And then historic properties are treated somewhat differently. They may be considered conforming with respect to any height, setback, yard area, or other dimension. And so we do give special treatment to historic structures that are within the Old Village Historic District. So how did we get here? I kind of talked about that already. Town council lowered the height in certain areas of the overlay district, and we also removed properties from the overlay district. So we ended up with a development that not only was non-conforming with regards to height and setbacks and lot sizes, but also the use. When it was removed from the overlay, you had single-family uses existing on area-wide business zoned property, and that's not a permitted use. When it was in the overlay, the use was allowed. So this was kind of the prime example of non-conformity. It's literally non-conforming due to almost every way you could think of. So height, density, lot size, lot setback, the use. So this kind of brought up this issue, and so council tasked us with looking at how we could amend our ordinances to perhaps deal with non-conforming issues in a different manner. So just a little bit on how other municipalities handle this. And just one thing to point out, just because a municipality has an ordinance dealing with non-conforming uses and structures doesn't necessarily mean it's been tested legally. So while we wanted to point out what some other municipalities have done and what they have in their ordinances, we want to be careful that whatever we look at is defensible. And just because it exists in another ordinance doesn't mean it's legal. It just means it hasn't necessarily been challenged yet. And so kind of wanted to lay that out there, and whatever we decide to do will certainly take some vetting by our legal counsel. And so, but just Mount Pleasant, we already went over our regulations. Sullivan's Island, they also have that 50% rule, much like Mount Pleasant. The use may be restored in as close conformity with the regulations of the ordinance as possible. You have to get your building permit and zoning compliance certificate within 12 months. And then if there's damage, you have to get it fixed within 2 years. City of Charleston, there is no percentage, but nonconformities cannot be expanded or reinstated without a variance. And then abandoned nonconforming uses may not be reinstated, and there's a 3-year vacancy rule. Charleston County has the 50% rule. They look at commercial or industrial uses are not allowed to rebuild, so they differentiate between their residential and non-residential. And I'll talk about that in a minute, because I know that was one of the directions we were headed originally. Residential is okay within the building footprint and height limits, so you can build back what you have, basically. Repairs, restoration, or reconstruction must begin within 12 months of the damage. And then Columbia has a 75% rule. Structure shall not be rebuilt, altered, or repaired except in conformity with their current zoning. 6 months within the time of damage, and then you have 12 months after your building permit issuance to get your work complete. I'm just going to go through these briefly. Greenville has a 50% rule. Spartanburg, 50%. You can see that Spartanburg does exempt single-family residences. Myrtle Beach, Somerville. Myrtle Beach does not have a limit, and then Somerville, Conway, and Brunswick, Georgia all have the 50% rule. And Wilmington, North Carolina is not limited by percent, but subject to different restrictions. And y'all can read that for yourself. So when I first presented this in February, we had this slide here, and then we had some other sort of draft text amendments. And when we talked about this in February, we were going to come back in March and head in a direction that kind of the February meeting took us in. And of course, March meeting got canceled and with COVID and everything. But in the meantime, we've been looking, and staff has been looking at this and researching this topic. And I'll explain why these are struck through in a minute. So previously, we talked about options 2, 4, and 5. So if we go back, if you'll recall in February, you kind of wanted us to look at the differences between neglect and natural disaster. Perhaps we could treat those differently. We talked about making distinctions between single family, all residential, and then non-residential. And then we also talked about distinguishing between a benign nonconformity and a detrimental nonconformity. Since then, we've been doing a little more research, and we came up with perhaps we would still look at 2 and 4. I'm sorry, option 2, which is still relevant, where we talk about differentiating between the different types of disaster. But what we wanted to look at as far as 4 and 5 was this new one here, number 6, and that's make special distinctions between the utilization of the property versus the physical characteristics. Mm-hmm. So what we thought was this would help us to perhaps create an ordinance that's a little bit more defensible, and we would regulate not so much according to what we were looking at before, but more as a category or a compartment. So differentiating between the use of the property versus those physical characteristics and the impacts both of those have on the surrounding community. And what we would do is the degree of restriction made applicable to each separate category would be a function of the degree to which that category is a nuisance or incompatible with our current regulations and the surrounding properties. And so right now our ordinances are split up between, we have non-conforming lots, non-conforming structures and buildings, and non-conforming uses. And going through and researching how some other folks have done this, and some some legal studies on this. Staff kind of felt like it might be good for us to explore and put this before the commission of what if we look at non-conforming uses or the utilization of the property, and then we look at structures, and then some things that we've come up as far as just administratively things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis are, you know, you may have a non-conforming structure. It may be a principal structure that's encroaching into a setback, or it may be a shed or a pool. And these are just some things I want to throw out to you that we deal with and that we need to think about. So, for instance, do we want to treat a non-conforming principal structure the same as a non-conforming accessory structure that may be at grade and not above grade? And for instance, a pool or something like that, a patio. Is the non-conforming patio as serious of an issue as a non-conforming house? And then we talk about, is a non-conforming house as serious as a non-conforming commercial building? Then we thought about pairing it off also into non-conforming development sites, or what some have called other non-conformities. So when you talk about, you know, having a use that's not conforming versus having the building, the principal structure that's non-conforming, or is it something like your site improvements, such as your landscaping? And then we would likely keep our non-conforming mobile home or non-conforming lots, and then signage. And just doing some research, and it made a lot of sense. If you think about when this whole issue of non-conforming came about, it came about during the industrial period when there were negative impacts of industrial uses on residential areas. So really the idea was to separate these uses. Today, between advances in technology, we have more strict environmental regulations, and then we have more comprehensive zoning and building codes. The ideas related to creative and diverse mixed-use developments, these same traditional practices are kind of outdated. So you think about just in Mount Pleasant, how many problems or instances of an industrial use or a use that's just thought of as such a nuisance is it next to a residential use. Now, oftentimes, you know, people in a residential area may not particularly like a commercial use next to them. But when we talk about getting rid of non-conforming properties because they are a nuisance and because of their negative impact, you know, that's one thing. But when we talk about Mount Pleasant and where we're at today, and we talk about infill and redevelopment, those are the things that we kind of want to look at. And how can we treat those non-conforming uses in such a way that we can incorporate them and make them into nice mixed-use areas? And then there's the physical characteristics. So think about a non-conforming use, something that is a nuisance that we do want to go away at some point, versus a non-conforming development site. So an example of a parking lot is reconstructed. It must either comply with the current zoning standards for dimensions and landscaping, or if it's a site of infill, they don't have enough space to meet all those standards, then they have to meet as many of those standards as possible. So basically, don't increase the nonconformity. Meet as many nonconformities and remedy those as much as you can. But let's not, make a site meet almost an impossible standard when we're talking about infill and redevelopment. And so those are the things we kind of wanted you to think about as far as, early on when we talked about residential versus non-residential. Staff was just kind of thinking in terms of maybe we need to look at the use and versus these development sites and these other types of non-conforming, and perhaps a more equitable way to deal with them is not based on residential, non-residential. I like this, but I don't like that, and more of the degree to which it's non-conforming. And so we have these different restrictions, and we apply this based on the level of nonconformity. And I'm going to kind of stop there. I know Liz and Kent and Jeff are on here, And I'd like for them to perhaps add in anything I may have left out, or I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Anybody else? Jeff, Liz, anybody want to add anything at this time?
This is Jeff, and I might be echoing or not.
You're
I think
good.
Michelle presented it. I said in the time we've had since we first started the discussion of this with you, then we've had a little bit more, actually probably some experiences with some actual real world sites in the interim period. And that gives you that practical real world experience with them. And so that kind of has helped maybe push us a little bit to look at other options and alternatives. And it, like she said, it's almost, you view it as almost this sort of hierarchy of definitely something that you want to, remove and get rid of, to, the scale or a spectrum. And are there other things that saying, and the alternative that you see a lot of communities deal with is the fact that if I own a site and you're going to make me go and meet every single 2020 zoning standard and requirement, and I can't do it, or it's overly, cost prohibitive, and I walk, then the community is left with this site and, whatever that's goes into decay and doesn't get used. And it's sort of a balancing act. Would you rather have it improved to as much as possible and accept the fact that maybe it doesn't have all the parking or all the buffering, or do you take the hard line and say, nope, it's an all or nothing game? And so that's what we were trying to lay out for you, is perhaps this is sort of a gradient kind of approach. And like she said, we don't then have to deal with distinguishing, treating residential one way versus non-residential. That goes away if we have an alternative method for dealing with the different non-conforming situations. And we can provide more background and information on, what other communities have done, but just thought we'd toss that out this time as part of the refresher and maybe a slight change in direction, and see how y'all think about what we've laid out here. Good job, Michelle.
Thank you.
So Michelle and Jeff, this is Brett Bennett. I'm curious as to, given the research you've done in other communities, this must be a model that's been applied elsewhere. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the reason I ask is really because of the sensitivities that you've already highlighted previously about legal defensibility. So the fact that this model is in place elsewhere at least suggests that it's passed muster with the legal community in one form or another.
We can hope.
Okay. I didn't know if there was any case law that where municipalities or other government entities have had to make modifications to this sort of model.
I think what you see is
for, interceding.
What's that, Kent?
What is the protocol for interceding into the conversation?
You're doing it.
Okay, you just come on board. From my experience with it, the bulk of the legal vetting is on, and it's been going on, like Michelle said, since zoning was enacted, and it obviously has to do with property rights and letting people remain whole, but it's also eventually the case law now is to eliminate these, is not to let them keep going on. And so that's where the bulk of the case law is. And Jeff had mentioned, and Michelle did too, at the beginning of this, that whatever endeavor we embark upon that's kind of contrary to that, it needs to be vetted by legal to make sure that we want to be doing the right thing, that it would be defensible if we get taken to court. And as Jeff said, well, we hope so, or probably so. But all of it needs to be vetted if we're going to go down a separate path.
And I think what we can do is work with legal on that. I just happened to run across a really good example today, and it was from the city of Auburn, Alabama, and laid out some of this. So we could clearly go to look at those communities and see if their approaches have been tested or not, say in those other states. But you almost see it already even in South Carolina, for instance, where the percentage of nonconformity piece varies. It's 50% or it's 75 or there's no number or whatever. So that already shows you that communities, there isn't a bright line there in terms of you got to do it this particular way, perhaps.
Yeah, and Brett, just to follow up on that, I think one of our biggest concerns when all of this started was why can't we just allow these things in perpetuity? And when you talk about, it's one thing to allow a residence to go on in perpetuity on a commercial property, but what if it's a use we don't like or somebody doesn't like, and we say, well, we've got to allow it in perpetuity, and it becomes very subjective, and that's where you get into trouble. And it really goes against the whole purpose and intent of our non-conforming ordinance. If you're gonna, they're supposed to be repugnant, and we want to get rid of them, but at the same time, we want to allow them in perpetuity, depending on what it is. And so those are the things that we have to be real careful about. And so, when we talked about differentiating between residential and non-residential, and, some non-residential uses may be fine, but others may not. And maybe a single family is fine, but what about a multifamily apartment? And so it just got to be a little dicey. And we thought the level of nonconformity just maybe, like he said, like Jeff said, a more gradient approach to it, and obviously, this is something that we'd have David and Julia help us with. But
well, one last comment from me. At least conceptually, I like the notion of scoring or prioritizing which areas of nonconformity we meaning really the elected officials, as well as the appointed representing the community would prioritize, or rank order in terms of, how strongly we view, the necessity of there be some change, into the future. Otherwise, my concern, especially given the detail and the longer term vision for the town, right now, you could argue that we're really trying to boil the ocean, with all the nonconformity that presently exists, and without prioritizing, like at least is implied with the model you've outlined here, it would be very difficult, I think, to achieve. You just achieve it in piecemeal fashion over a really lengthy period, and here at least there's some prioritization, I suppose.
Yep. Thanks, Brett. That was I agree with those comments. We'll just go in order, alphabetical order. Let me first, Mr. McCormick, I know you have to leave earlier. Is there anything that you wanted to add before you had to leave? I believe at 2:45.
No, I don't. I agree with what Brett said, and unfortunately, I've got to bail at 2:45. And have a good rest of the meeting. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, sir. Let's just go in the order of Mr. Davis. Do you have anything at this time? Mr. Davis?
I'm going to unmute.
Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
There you
Yes.
Okay. So, they were talking about, properties that, are non-conforming, and you want to just leave a vacant lot or do you want to, change some of the requirements to make it more attractive? I mean, I don't feel that you should say, well, it doesn't conform and that's it, take it or leave it. I think that each situation like that, should be considered in consideration of, what's best for the town and what's best for the, the community that surrounds that particular area, as opposed to just saying, well, your property doesn't conform and that's it. That's something I have to say about that part of it.
Thank you, sir. I've just got an applicable order here. Ms. Ireland, do you have anything at this time?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah, just a few comments. One is, and I know this is sort of parked elsewhere, but I just wanted to say, I think distinguishing between neglect or deferred maintenance versus the act of God sort of situation. So the outside of the owner's control is really critical here. And the other thing I thought was the residential. What worries me about residential is that it's where people live, obviously. So I just would have to really further understand what sorts of, the best you can kind of requirements there would be. In other words, I think that we should give more deference, as long as it's not an owner's fault, to, restoring to the extent that it existed before, just because, if my house is in conformance, but let's say it was, 10 feet higher than what the new height would be for a residence, would I have to then lose a story or something? So, I think the principal structure issue is key there. I totally agree that things like patios and stuff and little ancillary structures or sheds aren't as important, but I just think we need to be very sensitive to residences. And then the last point I wanted to make is that I didn't write down the exact wording of this new concept, but if it's sort of like requiring that an owner of a property do the best they can, in other words, correct the nonconformity to the extent practicable, so that they don't just say, well, I can't do it, so I'm going to walk. What worries me there, and we just have to think about, is who decides how far they go? What if they decide that they don't want to spend very much money? What is the practical, what is the extent, or who's the arbiter of that? So again, there may be much more detail that we just haven't talked about, but those are the things that come to mind initially. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks. Mr. Getting?
Yeah, I've listened to all the comments. I don't really take any exception, so I don't want to add to it. Appreciate the work that the staff has done on this and the updates from what was done earlier in the year. Other than that, I'm fine.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Ms. Smith?
I can't hear. Can you hear Kathy?
Ms. Smith, are you there? Are you muted?
Can't read lips.
She is muted. Hit your mic button. You see a little in your...
Unmute. Michelle's like unmute.
It's in the toolbar.
I just found it. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now. There you go.
Okay, I'm sorry, boys and girls. This is my first Teams meeting. Okie doke.
You passed.
I will agree with Pam's first comment, that I do see a distinction between demolition by neglect and demolition by natural disaster. That is a topic that we spent a good amount of time on the meeting we had in February. And at that time, I believe we were in agreement that that a person should be able to rebuild their house in the event of significant damage. I mean, we're here in the Low Country and we're dealing with hurricanes. And I believe we had kind of come up with some preliminary wording to that effect. I personally would use a combination of assuming that, you know, it's not the use that is non-conforming. In other words, this is a residential property on a residential lot. It's still zoned residential, but for whatever reason, you know, their house is too big, their lot's too small, whatever. I would like to see a combination of allowing that owner to rebuild, to not change the footprint of the structure, and perhaps require a variance so that, I mean, almost really coming before the commission, you know, the way we're looking at sketch plans to see that they are, in other words, if there are some items where they cannot comply, not enough parking spaces or whatever, that you have some oversight that they've given it their best efforts. That's all I'll say right now.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah.
Yes. One thing I mentioned in February's meeting that I kind of learned being on the commission was no matter what percentage we're talking about rebuilding, the 50% or whatever number is designated is only on the building value. It does not include the land. And so I think that's a good distinction to remember, that obviously a lot of the value around here is in the land. And so when you take 50% of a residence, and that was part of the reason we looked at trying to separate it, doesn't go very far for a lot of around here. I did have a question with two things. First, the flood insurance is totally separate. So that's a good important to note, that any kind of flooding we have, the federal regulations, and I'll form this as a question, has no impact on what we do through the town for this ordinance, correct?
That's correct. That's a separate ordinance.
Okay.
Well, it only applies, Joseph, to their regulations, which are very limited. All that has to do with meeting the National Flood Insurance Program requirements. Our things go way, way beyond that. So if your question is, can the town negate them meeting the flood stuff? No, that's we can't do that. But our stuff goes like height, setbacks, use, lot coverage, all that, and it applies. The flood stuff doesn't have anything to do with that.
Right. Yeah, that's what I just wanted confirmation on that, and not to convolute the two. Now, does an overlay district, and I'm thinking, for instance, the Old Village Historic District, and think of the commercial properties that are there that I'm sure are non-conforming, what would take precedence over any action through this? Would it be the overlay or this ordinance?
Again, as currently written on the overlays, their requirements take precedence over everything else. But, you know, if you wanted this to, but that's only if it's in conflict. You see what I'm saying? The hierarchy that exists with the overlays, they're on top, and next would be any planned development ordinances, if they're in place, which there are some, but not many. Then there would be design review board standards, then the actual zoning district requirements and other town regulations, which there are no requirements of an overlay district, I think, that would apply, that would negate our non-conforming use section of the code. I don't think it would even apply. So like, there's nothing in there that would supersede it.
Joseph, are you referring to the section where it differentiates between the Old Village Historic District?
I actually was just referring as a general question. I was just wondering about the hierarchy, because like I know, for instance, probably the Old Village Post House with setbacks, with parking, with things like that. And I know this I just wanted to see how things stood when we were talking about changing ordinances and what took precedent. I guess it's more constitutional questions.
They're all part of the zoning code, so you'd have to put all of that into the mix to determine how something and what something is non-conforming with respect to. So, I mean, it could be that the overlay imposes some standard, an additional standard related to color of the houses. And that's a zoning requirement, like all the, the setbacks. So you'd have to put the whole package together, all the zoning regulations, and say, how does this particular use stack up? You want to change something, which way do you have to go, or how do you deal with it? So they're all achievable.
Joseph, you were talking about two different overlays, like the Boulevard Overlay District. I don't think there's anything in there that would conflict. However, in the Old Village, yes, it does. But it clearly states in their overlay district regulations that their determination with respect to certain items, such as setbacks and other things, take precedence. So that is that hierarchy. It would go into effect there. You have to look at each situation in its own context. And what are the provisions that apply to that specific situation mean? So in the area of the Old Village, if they didn't meet the setback and their house burned down to the ground and they wanted to build something new, they, as written currently, they would have jurisdiction over where that setback is. If it were in, say, the Boulevard Overlay District, and it was maybe it didn't meet the Bill 2 line, which is what they currently have now, and the building was destroyed, they would have to meet that Bill 2 line now, because that's what it says in that overlay district. They couldn't build the building back in the same place that it was previously.
Okay, thank you. No, that was a good explanation. And that was pretty much it. I really appreciate staff Michelle putting this together. I really like the physical characteristics and the use or utilization of the plan. And I also agree with Ms. Ireland and Ms. Smith with the act of God exemption, because I can think of circumstances where somebody might not be able to, for several reasons, probably not be able to do what they wanted to do in the time frame necessary. So with that, is there anybody that has any additional questions or follow-up?
So I have a question for you.
Mr. Davis.
Okay, so you were talking about values, and separating the land value from the value of the property. So how do you determine that value? Like on your tax bill, like on my tax bill, it has my house and it has, the amount of land I have, but the values aren't separated. So how do you have to have appraisals, or how do you do that?
It is actually separated on the county website. If you just go to it, they provide a land value and a improvement value, and actually it's capped too. So really, what you would need to do is have an appraiser do it, because the county, what you see on the county tax records, it does not necessarily reflect the true market value of the land or the improvements.
So you'd have to have an appraiser come out and say the house is worth X, and the value on which the house sits is worth Y, and so we use the value for X to determine whether it's 50% or is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
And we also you get a cost estimate, right?
Our building official would estimate the cost of what it would be to put it back as it was, and so you balance those two. And if it's under 50%, then you're okay. If it's over 50%, you need to come into compliance.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious what the process was for valuation. Now you answered my questions. Thank you.
Hey, Joseph, apologize for coming in late. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Mr. Campbell, we sure did. Is there anything that you've heard so far that you want to add at this time before letting anybody else speak?
Kind of along what was just discussed, in Smee Farm, a house was almost quadrupled in size, and every bit of the land was house versus where it was before. So valuation-wise, is that does that count as far as nonconformity, or how did they get away with something like that? So it went from maybe 600,000 to $1.5 million.
I'm not sure we can speak specifically. I'd have to look at that and see what the site plan. If it was a new house or an addition, it had to go through our site plan improvement process. So somebody probably reviewed that. But I can talk to you about that after the meeting. And that's maybe a little bit different than non-conforming.
Yeah, it may or may not have been non-conforming to begin with. And then what they built would meet today's standard. I mean, it could have been that big or that, even before. It's not really the value that we're trying to get at. It's the degree of when something is damaged or destroyed and you want to go and replace it, and it's non-conforming. If the idea is to get rid of these things and you're going to do 93% replacement value, almost, double what was there before, then that house or that structure is going to be there for a heck of a long time again in the future, and you're not getting rid of it, right? I mean, the premise is over time, these things go away. Making that kind of investment and ignoring that just continues the nonconformity longer into the future. So say I'm going to make some repairs that are 30%, well, you're not really, going too far astray. But now I'm going to make repairs and they're 93% of the replacement value of that house. Well, you don't have any intent of conforming to today's zoning. You just want to, build something new on that site. So it's the premise from which you start. How much improvement or replacement can somebody do where you don't cross a threshold to say, well, that's not bad, but here so much investment has been made that it thwarts your objective of eliminating that over time.
Kathy Smith here.
Yeah, Ms. Smith, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Joseph. So I have a question / concern. And that is, if we dig inside, when is it that the town deals with non-conforming properties? My experience has been sometimes it's when we annex properties in from the county, and their lot may not meet all of our land development regs, things like that. My biggest concern, however, is what has been going on in the town the past 10 years, I would say 6 years, where our town council, quite honestly, has gotten extremely schizophrenic about zoning and overlays and all of this. And how can you protect the town people, when first you have, this whole overlay, then you take it away, then you lower the heights, then you say, no, you can't have residential, but you did say 3 years ago you could have residential. That is my biggest concern. And what do we do to the regulations to protect people that are in good faith at the time purchasing these properties, whether they're commercial or residential? Anyway, somebody answer me that.
Ms. Smith, this is David.
Hi, David.
I'll answer it in this capacity. To the extent, because you're right, planning has to deal with a lot of those changes and continuous changes. The level of protection afforded to the landowners is through vested rights. So when there is a change, of course, if there's a vested right to build something, that is there. Now that is limited. It's limited to a certain period of time. It's limited to what you intend to build, and you may be talking more about things that are already on the ground. Mm-hmm. And of course, should there be a storm event or substantive change of that like, that's going to cause problems. I don't know of any mechanism that's going to protect those from what you're referring to as changes. Let's say it's the Coleman Boulevard Overlay District, which we've seen numerous changes to. And quite honestly, we've had some growing pains with those changes over the years. I'm afraid that aside from vested rights, there's very little that we can do to change that after the fact, meaning if and when council makes changes to those places, that's what they are. If we start a process where we uniformly grant some sort of, well, you can always have what you've had, well, then that sort of negates the entire, we're telling some people they can have it and some people they can't.
Right.
And that really negates the entire zoning process in some ways. So
Yeah.
I'm probably not giving you a good answer, but.
No, you're not, but
Sir.
I accept it.
Yeah.
Hey, David, is there in
Mr.
case
Campbell,
of
go ahead.
a major storm, could the town be overwhelmed by something like this?
Something like, what do you mean as far as?
A Yugo or that came in and destroyed a good portion, would we be overwhelmed?
Well, I think, with depending on the areas, of course, that it's hit, if there have been changes in that area, and it under the current ordinance, if it meets that threshold, more than 50%, and you have to go under the new rules. Look, the more changes that any governmental entity, any municipality makes over time, the more people are going to be affected. And to Ms. Smith's point, the more changes and the significant changes that we've seen are just simply going to affect more and more people. I don't want to put planning on the spot, but as to whether we have numbers, as to whether we've tracked how many people would be affected, I'm not sure that we have that ability to answer that right now.
There's no doubt it's probably become more complex due to that rapid rate of change and adjustment, and the requirements are one thing one year and something different the next. Yes. I mean, our jobs as staff just, exponentially increase in terms of the complexity of sorting your way through a situation like that. But we have real world examples right now. I mean, we've got several that we're dealing with. For instance, Kent, what's the one the Montessori school, the former elementary school on Rifle Range. And they want to make improvements to that site. And then the question becomes, well, it doesn't meet today's zoning standards for maybe parking requirements, drive aisles, buffering, screening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have a real world case where we're trying to go through that. Another one is the former O2 Fitness on Johnny Dodds, right. And they want to convert that to office uses and change that up. Well, we've been working on that one for months, trying to sort through it's just as you move into more of this reuse and redevelopment, then the amount of time we spend on these goes up. When everything was being new and you were meeting today's standards, whatever the heck they were, that was easy. Now it's tough, relatively easy. Now you're going backwards and trying to sort through all of that and figure out where do they comply, where do they not comply, and then what are all the improvements and things. And then when we tell somebody, hey, guess what? You exceed a standard, you exceed the percentage, you have all of these different things that you now have to bring up to snuff. That's when we hear them say, well, I can't do it, and they go away. And you're right, Kathy, some people will say, well, I can't do it. I mean, you have to have some when you want to get and define that to the maximum extent practicable. We're going to have some standards in there and say, what does that really mean? You can't just say, just because I don't think it is, me, the property owner, and get away with that. I mean, you have to have a better test than that if you're going to go in that particular direction.
Thank you, Jeff.
Can I ask a question? This is Pam Ireland.
Yeah, Ms. Ireland, and then Mr. Bennett. I saw he had a question too. Go ahead, Ms. Ireland.
Great. Yeah, I totally agree, Jeff, with what you just said, and that was my point earlier about, we've got to have some parameters if it's going to be a sort of a practicality or a practicable standard. did I miss, or are we going to go into something afterwards about what the distinction is between benign versus detrimental nonconformities? Because I'm not sure I really have good examples in my head of those.
So Pam, that was the direction we were kind of heading at the last meeting. And what we did was sort of changed it up, and it's the same idea. Instead of benign, perhaps it's the physical characteristics. Think of a benign nonconformity in terms of, like Jeff said, they don't meet all their landscaping, or they're two parking spaces short. Probably in terms of overall, it's fairly benign. And when you talk about detrimental, you're probably talking more about the use. It's a use that is just absolutely not compatible with the area. And so what we did is sort of change those terms, if you will, to talk more about the use and the utilization versus the various physical characteristics. And so that's where we kind of had. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. In my mind, that's sort of like minor versus major, although I understand
right.
That's, those are not necessarily the right terms either, but right. I get it. Thanks.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Bennett?
Thank you, Joseph. Back to the issue of nonconformity and a natural disaster or some other catastrophic event. I was reminded that this was an issue that was front and center in so much of the discussion that the Shem Creek Advisory Committee had for a couple of years or more. There was, I think I can say, unanimity with respect to the concern for that possibility, or the possibility of some event like a Hugo, because most of at least the commercial properties along the creek are non-conforming as defined by the OCRM standards, as well as flood insurance requirements. And so just very quickly, the philosophy and how this can be made practical from a regulatory or an enforcement standpoint, I'm sure is complex. But at least conceptually, it was the view of the advisory committee that all the property owners and or commercial enterprises that are in place and operating should be allowed to return to whatever square footage was in place prior to such a catastrophic event. And so I don't know whether that offers anything of a guidepost for other parts of the town, but at least specific to Shem Creek, that was the philosophy or rule of thumb that we came away with.
I can speak to that for you, Brett.
I'm sorry, Kent?
I can speak to that for you.
Yeah, please.
The OCRM requirements and the NFIP requirements are one. Obviously, the NFIP is federal, the OCRM are state. We have no control over those. So whatever their requirements are, they have to meet. But we have control over town standards. And the easiest way, in my opinion, to address that would be through the Shem Creek Waterfront Overlay District. Right. Is just come up with a set of standards that would allow them, to the extent possible, to go back how they were. Now, they're still going to have to elevate the buildings if they don't meet flood elevation requirements. And OCRM may very well not let certain non-water dependent businesses go back in the same location they are in now, but the town has no control over that. But right. To the things that we do have control over, it's a fairly easy fix just to go in and adopt the standards that would best suit them through an overlay district.
Right, and Kent just articulated, from a more practical standpoint, what we were faced with. Really, what brought on so much of our discussion as the advisory committee was, in the event of a natural disaster, the rebuild of the structures along the creek would have a very different look and feel than what we're accustomed to today. But all that notwithstanding, it was the view of the advisory committee that returning the square footage to those property owners and lessees was the priority, as opposed to, the look and feel, and everybody would just have to accept the fact that it would be different after some sort of catastrophic event. So thanks, Kim.
Brett,
Sure.
just to follow up on that as well, and what Kent explained, we talked about the overlays and the hierarchy, and that was something that I think I had on a slide, and I neglected to mention was the concept of special area management plans. And I know Jeff or Liz had talked about that, and I don't know if either of them want to expand on it, but that was certainly along with the overlays, that was a way that we could address this sort of thing too, because I think all of you have sort of said in one fashion or another that it's not a one size fits all. And so there is the idea of using special area management plans to address it. And I don't know, Jeff or Liz, if y'all want to expand on that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Michelle, in terms of what you're already seeing is, again, a tool that's today maybe kind of coarsely defined. Mm-hmm. And now you're talking about maybe refining a tool to use it in different ways. You already have an exception and have said in the old village, if I'm non-conforming, I get differential treatment than a house in, Snee Farm, for instance. So you've already made a policy decision that you want to do something different for that area. So what we're seeing is, depending on the situation, the area of the community that you're in, you may want to lean towards, but it's this way in this area. We treat them that way in another area, and we treat them a third way in a third area. And so it's just that, again, less a one size fits all, and you have to be able to craft these things in a more refined way to get at what the community is trying to achieve. I'm looking, by the way, at the city of Miami did a zoning code update, and I noticed that their opening line is that they were concerned about hurricanes, and which they are prone to experience. And their whole nonconformity provisions, they said were being rewritten at the time. I think this is maybe a year or two old, to be able to give protection to homeowners that do not exist today under the current zoning ordinance. So they clearly had to respond to hurricane, natural disaster situations, and change up their game. And that's, the kind of discussion I think we've been having, particularly like with, say, Sullivan's Point or Shem Creek. The what if the worst thing happens. So it's not unheard of that you would be able to address these kinds of things.
Thank you, Jeff. I think I saw Ms. Smith with the hand up.
Yes, I did have my hand up. I just wanted to bump up what we've just been talking about against the direction we need to go in terms of resilience and sea level rise, because I feel we can be at conflict there as well. In the past year or so, we've already, we increased the critical line buffer, right? From 15 feet to 30 feet. That can put all of a sudden houses in non-compliance. In other words, their buffer yard isn't big enough. Some communities that are coastal have taken the stance that, nope, it's more important that we protect the town as a whole from the issues of flooding and stuff, so that if in that example, if that house got damaged, greater than 50% or whatever, they would not be allowed to build. I mean, at one level, I suppose that amounts to a taking. But, in other words, I guess my concern is we've got it's so multifaceted, and I just want to make sure that we look at non-compliance as it might bump up against the issues of resiliency and sea level change. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Anyone else like to speak? Michelle, is there a way you can go back to your screen with the options that y'all have kind of thought through with updated options?
Joseph, can you hear me? I had my phone on my.
Yeah, Mr. Davis.
So I was thinking about what Kathy had to say, about maybe you can do this, maybe you can do that, and it's probably not the forum to bring this up, but I keep going back and keep thinking about the people from Miller Cadillac that were in, I guess a few months ago. And I guess I don't entirely know their situation, but all I know is from what I understand, they have a piece of property and they want to do something with it, and they're kind of stymied. Are they waiting for us? Or are they waiting for the council? I mean, it's like Kathy said, some of the rules are just inconsistent, I guess, for lack of a better word, so I just keep thinking about Miller Cadillac and those people that were there. And so what happens in situations like that where people come in, they want to do something? I mean, do they have to conform to everything that's in existence right now, or do they ask for variances? And it may not be just Miller Cadillac, it may be somebody else who's in the same situation.
Yeah, they'd have to conform.
Yes, because they never filed anything with us. Here's what we want to build.
They can proceed. They could build something, or if it qualifies for variances, they could seek variances for what they want to do. I think what they're waiting for is sort of maybe the dust to settle, and we'll be talking about it with council tomorrow, the whole discussion of potentially lowering building heights along that Johnny Dodds corridor. So I think they're sort of sitting there waiting maybe for at least that particular height issue to be resolved. But when we talk about to them and potential developers on that site, we talk about everything. You've got requirements to pull buildings to the street. You've got requirements to have retail on the ground floor. You have requirements that deal with height. And there are a lot of rules and regulations. And somebody could develop that site if they chose or were able to follow the rules. So we're not technically stopping them from proceeding. They just might not be able to do what they want to do with the property.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I understand. I get it. I get it now. So, okay. Thank you, Jeff. That explains it to me.
Sure.
Thank you.
Can y'all see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay.
And I guess my question is, since you further studied the issue and you thought more about the recommendation to separate the residential versus commercial, is that a fair statement?
Yes. At this point.
Okay. Where do we see in town, because you all know better than I, non-conforming commercial? Obviously, maybe Shim Creek, but has other issues, other things going on there. Anywhere else that maybe we should be aware that non-conforming commercial properties?
Yeah, I think Jeff hit on a big one, was the former Echo workout facility. It's my understanding, to be conforming, to change their use to an office use, they may have to build another story. So those are the sorts of things. It's the build to lines. So I think there's quite a few properties probably along Johnny Dodds where we're dealing with this sort of thing.
Right. This is Liz. I would think, Joseph, that anything pretty much along, like Michelle just said, along Johnny Dodds that was built 20, 30 years ago when our rules were different, it met the rules back then. But think of what's changed in the intervening time. And so some aspect of it is going to be non-conforming, whether, as we've talked, it's something kind of benign or, not, I can't remember our new word, but that, trees and buffers and landscaping or the location of the building. Do you pull that old, what is it, Center Oak Plaza that has no oak trees left in the parking lot? Do you pull that building up to 17? And put the parking behind it if they chose to redo that particular property. I think there'd be quite a few now that we're starting to look at the redevelopment of things that were developed, a generation ago.
Mm-hmm. Or even due to the changes, Kathy Smith here. The boulevard right now is non-compliant from a commercial standpoint because it is higher than we currently allow. So if the boulevard got damaged more than 50%, they couldn't build an apartment building as tall as what is there right now.
Also exceeds the density requirement too.
Exactly. Thank you, Ken.
But I mean, people, they deal with these issues. That's why I call them Swapper Jacks, Trader Joe's. They called it that on The Simpsons one time. They kept it under 50% for that same reason. Same thing that happened with the where the Nordstrom Rack and the Dick's is. They kept it under 50%, but the new buildings that they put on that site, because it was large enough to accommodate new buildings, all of those meet the standards.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's just a thing of keeping it. If you don't want to meet the standard, you keep it under 50%. Mm-hmm. If you want to go over and above, then the town has a plan in place for how they want certain areas of the town to look. And it's there to achieve that goal. And if we don't want to achieve that goal, then heck, let's just get rid of those plans and
change the goal.
Something different.
Right.
Another good example too is the bylaw on Ben Sawyer. We've been looking at that, and it goes back to what Jeff mentioned. Do we want to relax some of these physical characteristics to be able to fill a large vacant building, or do we want the large vacant building until they come into complete compliance with our current standards? And that's one of the ones we're looking at right now, is what can they make work in that location without going over the 50%. And so I don't know. It's definitely a complex issue.
Mama said there'd be days like this.
Well, go ahead,
one final thing for me. Number 8 on the options to consider. I'm kind of in favor of that, to be honest with you, because I feel like the current draft, I have to use that word, maybe someday it'll be real, but the current draft update to the comprehensive plan is very different in some ways from what we have had in the past. And it might make a lot of sense for us to redo this whole nonconformity as it bumps up against the new update. Anyway, something to think about.
And Kathy, this is Jeff. I think we see it as sort of a 2-tiered process. We already know we have issues.
Right.
And Kent will agree, you can't write a perfect zoning ordinance ever.
I agree with that.
So it's kind of like, incrementalism. Can we make changes and improvements to what we already have and what we know we deal with? And then expect that when, say, the Shem Creek overlay gets changed, that you then, in collaboration with that or in parallel with that, we may need to go in and change the nonconformity provisions for that particular thing. So it's like a never-ending process, and do we put it off, and we are, as you know, the consultant nonconformity provisions are identified in the assessment report on the whole zoning code that you just got.
Yes, I saw that.
So we'll, it's kind of, work on it, improve it to the best of your ability at this stage, and then you'll probably be doing it again in a year or two. Once you know more.
Okay. So what's next?
That's a Planners Employment Act, by the way.
Kathy, I think what we as staff would like is maybe a motion to move ahead with drafting some ordinances, working with legal, but moving ahead in a certain direction, whether you want, and I think we all agree we're going to look at based on our conversation back from February, we're going to make changes to the natural disaster sort of stuff. That was always going to happen. I think we just need maybe a little more direction as to how to proceed with the gradient or the hierarchy of addressing these, that new idea, and anything else that you all see as important. Just provide us that direction, perhaps in a motion, and we can bring something a little more substantial back to you.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a very complex issue. This shows a complex issue, and you made some great examples of why. And I think we could, make a motion going forward. I'm just personally, in my opinion, I don't know what I would have to. Don't know exactly what exact direction to go in. Kind of looking and thinking it through more for my sake. But I'm open to any other motions or anybody else would like to, bring anything to the fore.
One thing,
even something, Joseph, that says, yeah, we think, with these adjustments that generally this is the track we want to pursue. And then staff, we'll expand on it and, give you more. It is a complicated topic. So to be able to try to do it in one or a half of a work session is tough to do. Right. And then we can report to council at the committee meeting, planning committee next week that, we've picked back up on this, and we could share a slide or two that just says for them to know, and planning commission and staff still need more time to work through this particular topic. But you're not ready to say adopt this ordinance, next week.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's I think this, you made some great recommendations on this. I really like this and the direction it's going. And to piggyback on that, and because we want to do it right, because part of the reason we're in some of the stuff that we see is because the ordinances, maybe we didn't flesh it out or didn't think all the way through with everything in mind at the time that they were adopted. And that's neither here nor there now, but that's what we're dealing with. And so that being said, I'd love to make this best we could.
Correct.
First time.
As a staff, we did our darndest when the Ben Sawyer segment of the overlay was getting pulled back. And we pointed out at the time, these are the situations and we had maps and slides in there that, anticipated this, but here we are. Now we're trying to respond to it. It didn't take, maybe it will this time.
Right. And a truer process too. I think we got it after first reading we held the public hearing on that part of it. Liz, did you have something to add?
I did. Wait, okay. Yeah, I've got my mic on. Okay. Sorry. I've been sitting here trying to take notes, and I think there are two things that I heard pretty clearly. That go along with what Michelle's got up here. There's a difference between, y'all agree with us that there seems to be a difference between a neglect situation and a natural disaster situation. I think we're all, so whatever we start, it sounds like that's a point of agreement between all of us who've voiced an opinion on that. So there's that angle. And there seems to be agreement also on the, for lack of a better term, the benign detrimental, the property versus use, that things like if you've got the right number of bushes in your landscaping is not really as important in the grand scheme of things as to whether or not the use is going to be a problem in the neighborhood, that those should be treated differently as well. I think I've heard that agreement in our conversations today. So one thing that we kind of touched on earlier, I think in the beginning of the slideshow, but we haven't really talked about, we talked a little bit about, this is a 50%, the 50% calculation is the trigger. If you're improving the building more than 50%, then you've got to come into conformity with however we define that going forward. And I guess one thing that I know has come up in the past, and Kent and Jeff and Michelle, tell me if I'm out of line here, I guess, but it seems like it'd be pretty straightforward, 50% of the assessed value of the value of the building if you're increasing it more than 50%, I know there have been situations where, that, okay, well, we're just going to increase it 48% now. And next year, we're going to come back in and ask to increase it another 25%. Is there some sort of cumulative thing that, I know this is getting a little more complicated, but is that somewhere we want to go?
I think we need to look at it. Yes, because that is an issue that we deal with. It's sort of that. I mean, we have that in other things like traffic or impact. You can't say, well, I'm going to only do this much to circumvent, mitigation requirements, for instance, and then come back with more, nickel and dime us to death, with those kinds of things. So I think whatever that percentage is, and then how that actually works, we definitely need to clear up so that we can apply it. Everybody has a different opinion about what that means and how you handle that.
This is Pam Ireland. I don't know if you can hear me, but
go ahead.
I'm thinking, I think to have something, and you could look at what you might have done in other situations similarly, but maybe the percentage in over a cumulative X number of year period, so that they can't come back in 3 years or 2 years and ask, and sort of do nickel and dime.
Right.
So it would be maybe over, so they'd be prohibited, essentially to come back for more changes. And
there's language,
saw what they had done. Yeah, like
sorry, there's language like that in the flood insurance.
Good.
Years.
Good.
And I just want to make sure that that y'all agree that might be something worth looking into.
Yes,
for sure.
That's a good loophole to fill or to correct.
I agree, and thanks for bringing that up, because like you said, the flood, I believe, is 10 years cumulatively, so whatever that is on it. But Liz, you had anything else?
I think that was it. I think it's been a good conversation. Thank you for your guidance.
Anyone else like to be heard?
My hand is raised. Yes, I am prepared to make a motion.
You have the floor.
All right. Kathy Smith. Oops, now there's back.
Where'd it go?
Okay. I would like to make a motion that the Planning Commission request that planning staff continue working toward an update of the non-conformity regulations utilizing options 2, 3, 5, and 6. And I need a second.
Is there a second? I will second. Ms. Joseph. All right, we have a motion, a second. Any discussion?
Not from me.
Just one question.
Yep.
We had spoken, and I think Kathy, you had spoken about your last meeting about having a real concern about the residential properties. So I know we're no longer using the distinction of residential versus non-residential, but when they go into, when staff goes into, or when this motion asks for an update based on these 2, 3, 5, and 6, will that be something that can be clarified in the benign and detrimental, or the utilization, I guess, number 6, the special distinctions? I would want to give more deference, in other words, to a person's home than I would maybe to an office building.
I think, this is Jeff, I think we can, keep that in mind. So not lose that thought. I mean, I don't think we're saying lose it totally. We were just talking, we thought maybe we could negate the need to have to make that distinction if we could come up with a better way to distinguish. But I think we still could keep that aspect of residential versus non-residential in mind as we do all of these things. And then I don't know if you want to amend it to include that, Kathy, but.
No, I don't. There was concern raised, as I recall, at our last meeting that, you know, maybe it is a slippery slope legally if we start making distinctions between, you know, oh, a residential property, we're going to handle them this way, and a commercial one, you know, we're not, you know. So my preference, honestly, would be to streamline the non-conform regulations, you know, in such a way that they apply very even-handedly to both residential and commercial.
That would be our ultimate goal. And then we can point out as we come back, if we run into that topic again, then you could revisit it if you want, but leave it the way you've suggested moving forward for now.
So this is Gary. I have a question. So Kathy, you eliminated number 8. Was that for a reason?
Yes, because I thought Jeff Olma spoke very well to that. And that is this. I thought it was like really cute. A, there's no perfect zoning regulations. B, they all have jobs for life. C, that this is a big enough issue that I think it's appropriate for us to kind of like keep climbing up the mountain, so to speak, working on this. And then ultimately, if we end up with something that we're comfortable with, the planning is comfortable, we're comfortable, and we're at the point where we're going to send it to town council, if in fact the update to the comprehensive plan is accepted, we have a final product, you know, that's the point at which I think we bump this, the non-conforming regs up against the updated comprehensive plan and say, okay, does it work? Maybe we need to do a little tweaking.
And Gary, we don't have to wait for it to get adopted, but as staff, as we work through this ordinance amendment, we know what's in the draft plan, and so we'll keep those things in mind as we craft this ordinance. Just those are things that we can think about as we write the ordinance. So maybe the word wait isn't a good idea, but we will certainly consider what the draft plan says.
Okay. All right. Well, that answers my question.
I think at the time, number 8, we were getting bombarded with requests to change 27 different ordinances at once. And so, I mean, number 1 was leave it alone, and number 8 was kick the can down the road. And neither one of those are good options. So I think you're in where we need to be.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Pagliarini, I think's on the line. I want to ask him too, because I did, Ms. Smith brought up a good point that I do remember there were some legal ramifications of considering residential versus commercial and making that distinction. David, can you add anything to that?
David did say he was going to have to be, he was checking in and out on things, so he may not be out there right now.
Okay.
But that's the legal consideration that Michelle and Kent raised or whatever. So all along, we're going to have to bounce this, whatever we do.
Right.
We need to bounce whatever it is against the legal considerations and then go from there.
Okay. Anyone else like to be heard before we call a vote on this motion?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? And the motion passes.
All right.
Thank you.
So,
Way to go, Kathy.
you all, Michelle, you all just, whenever you get a chance, obviously it might not be next month or whenever, just bring the ordinances to us along the way. Is that how it'll work?
Yeah, we'll start working in that direction, and we'll bring it back. We should be able to bring something back in August. I don't know if it'll be an exact draft text amendment, but it'll be more whittled down to what we've discussed. I think we can come up with something and bring it in August, not for public hearing.
Right.
That ad goes out tomorrow, but we'll give committee an update on Monday, and we'll bring something more specific back in August at the regular meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually prefer that, to have more, not a technical draft text and a special hearing it for the first time, as we could work through it and bounce ideas off each other.
Yeah.
Agreed.
All right, I appreciate everybody taking time out of this afternoon. See you
Nice
for-
job, everybody.
We're
Yes,
adjourned.
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
staff,
you.
for your hard
Yeah,
work.
well done, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hang up, Kathy. Red button.